Dungeons are a pivotal part of the WoW experience but can seem a bit scary and daunting to first jump into. Not to worry, in this sub-episode I'll be running through a dungeon explaining all there is to know about them so that you can feel comfortable diving in for the first time. Welcome to this leveling dungeon. We're just loading in. One of the first things I would like to mention about leveling dungeons is that they are relatively easy and simple. I'm not saying this to maybe mock anyone that's having some trouble with them. I'm saying this to introduce them as a pretty stress-free environment in which you can really practice your class and practice combat, specifically PvE combat in World of Warcraft. Other things to keep in mind while doing dungeons is to stick with the group, specifically stick with the tank. The tank in this case, I think, is this Windwalker monk. You can identify the tank by the little shield icon next to his portrait. And what I mean by sticking with the tank is that the tank in dungeons will usually dictate the tempo, dictate which mobs you're going to be pulling, dictate when you're going to be moving to the next pack, etc, etc. So just stick with him, follow his lead. It'll make the whole run smoother, and if you're doing stuff that he's not prepared for or that he didn't plan for, it'll most likely slow down the whole dungeon, which is not something that we would want. Another thing to keep in mind, or just these are general PvE content tips, is that when you are facing, let's say, 3 or more enemies, you should be focusing on abilities that deal damage in an area, or AoE abilities. So as you can see, I cast Rain of Fire there, because there were a bunch of mobs. And if you are facing fewer than 3 enemies, you can just switch to single target. So for me that would be like casting Incinerate or casting Chaos Bolt. It's just not efficient to use AoE abilities on fewer than 3 mobs, basically. One thing to keep in mind, you can, like I said, one of my AoE abilities is Rain of Fire, but you can kind of think of Immolate as an AoE ability, because it is a dot, and I can just click on different mobs, and I will be spreading that dot to all of them, which makes all of them are taking damage. The idea generally is that in scenarios where there are 3 or more mobs, all of them should be taking damage somehow. If that's spreading dots, if that's just casting ability that does damage in an area, both work. Just something to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind, or just a general strategy for dungeons, is to try and not take much damage. Try and just not take damage in general. This is usually not standing in fire, not standing in little swirlies like you see here. You'll just learn from experience that usually means something is going to fall there and it's gonna do damage. If you are going to take damage and it is unavoidable, then it is recommended to mitigate that damage somehow. You saw earlier I cast Unending Resolve because someone was channeling an ability on me and I just can't do anything about it. I'm just going to take the damage. And what Unending Resolve does is it makes it so that I take 25% less damage. So that is really great. And thirdly, if you already have taken damage, then you should try and heal yourself up to the best of your abilities. For me that would be, for example, casting Drain Life or any other abilities that you might have. Why we do this is because we are taking pressure off the healer. We generally don't want the healer to feel much pressure. Dungeons usually will have some unavoidable damage that you are just going to have to take, and if the healer is ready for when that happens, so they have full mana and they have their cooldowns that they can use, then you're going to fare a lot better in scenarios where there is unavoidable damage. And to achieve that, you just try and mitigate the damage you were taking earlier, or just try not to take it at all. The healer will also thank you and think you're a good player if he doesn't have to heal you as much. They will really appreciate it. It also allows the healer to do damage, which also speeds up the the dungeon overall. Right here we were fighting a boss, so as you saw, I was mainly focused on casting Chaos Bolt and generating my soul shards so I could cast Chaos Bolt. Here the tank went ahead, and we can see that he pulled the whole right side, but he didn't go anywhere near the left side, so we are going to do the same. Like I said earlier, we are following the tank. If he does something like this, then we do the same. Something to keep in mind, if you haven't noticed yet, is that all of these mobs are red, which means that if you get close enough to them, you will pull them, so don't get close. That is the general idea. Where you go and how you move in dungeons is very important, because you can accidentally pull mobs that you maybe didn't want to pull, or the tank didn't want to pull, which will in turn make it so the dungeon will take longer. But otherwise that's pretty much it when it comes to dungeons. Just follow the tank, stay as a group, try not to pull any extra mobs, try and stay healthy, and try to deal as much damage as you can, whether that be spread amongst more enemies or just focused on a single enemy. Right here, while we're moving from location to location, I'm gonna use a movement ability. This again speeds up the dungeon. While you're doing dungeons and while you're learning how to play your class, one thing to keep in mind is to always try and prioritize speed. In the end game, when we get to Mythic Plus dungeons, the main game or the main idea that you're trying to do is to complete the dungeon as fast as possible. So if you're already learning how to do that by using movement abilities, by mounting up when you can, you will be set up for success when you eventually get to Mythic Plus dungeons. Here I can see there are more enemies, so I'm gonna focus my time on getting 3 stacks of soul shards as fast as possible so that I can cast Rain of Fire. Here I spread Immolate on most of them, so now I finally get enough for Rain of Fire. I cast, and now I go to Incinerate to build up my soul shards. I see some mobs have been dropped on the floor, so I just move away from the swirlies. Here I think the tank already engaged the boss, so I'm just going to Curse of Weakness. This will make it so we take less damage. Now I just focus the boss down. In this case, I can see his ads are doing quite a lot of damage, so I'm gonna prioritize them before I then return to the boss. Bosses in this game have different mechanics, and the way to learn them, especially for the leveling dungeons, is to just play them and try and react to what they're doing. Maybe you get hit by one ability or something happens, and the next time that ability happens, you can kind of know what is going on because you paid attention the first time. When you get to the end game, when you get to Mythic Plus dungeons, it is expected that you look up what the dungeons do and how to play the dungeons, but we'll get there when we get there. For now, just try and see what the boss is doing, and oftentimes if you've played games before, you can kind of guess what you should do in order to win against him, I guess, in order to defeat him. Here I'm just gonna cast 2 Immolates to start generating some soul shards, and then go straight into casting Rain of Fire. As you can see, I'm clicking on different enemies, but I could also use tab. This switches to an enemy in kind of a cone in front of you, so if you don't want to click, you can just use tab as well. As you saw there, dungeons are also really good for leveling because they just award you with a lot of experience while you do them. I just got level 20 there, so yeah. Really useful to do them, but while we do these AoE packs, it's just Immolate on as much targets as possible, Rain of Fire, and then cast any Incinerates if I have the time and the resources to do so. Don't forget also to loot the mobs. You can get some gear. Sometimes it might be useful for you, and if it isn't useful for you, you can also try and sell it for some gold, which will also be important later on. Here it's just one enemy, and I was kind of expecting the tank to go ahead and pull some more enemies, so that's why I didn't cast Chaos Bolt on him because I was saving my soul shards for the pack, for the next pack basically. This is something that you can start learning while doing these leveling dungeons, and that is to not only think about the current pack and what you're doing right now, but to also start setting up for the next pack, because that means sometimes you want to pool your resources, sometimes you maybe don't want to use a defensive even if it gets scary, but you know that like the next pack is a lot scarier, so you would rather save your defensive for then, or your kick. I haven't really discussed kicks yet because I haven't had the opportunity. It's basically an ability to stop my enemies from casting, and sometimes you want to save that because they're casting an ability that, yeah, it might do a bit of damage, but I know that mob in the next pack has an ability that does way more damage, or like stuns the entire team, so I want to save it for that. I got a talent point, but I'm not gonna focus it or apply it right here. I'm just gonna focus on the boss and the dungeon itself so that we can go through it as fast as we can. Here, these are some types of damage to keep in mind. Sometimes abilities will leave pools on the ground, kind of like here. This is a golden pool, it might be some other color, doesn't really matter. The point is that if I step in it, I'm gonna take damage. You can see that here, but you can also see that my whole screen is up in flames, so the game is really kind of screaming at you to step out. Something is happening, you're taking damage, please step out. So yeah, it's just mainly you should just pay attention to it, and I think you should be fine. Here, while we're moving to the next pack, I'm just gonna mount up. I can see we have a few mobs here, so I'm gonna go with a rain of fire. Here I see a mob spawns directly on me. Okay, I just took the damage from it. Sometimes you just take damage, that's just the way it is. It's also the only way to learn, is to get hit by abilities until you figure out what they do and who casts those abilities, and then you can start to dodge them or mitigate them or deal with them in some other way. Here we can see the tank is running ahead a bit. Okay, we've already caught up. I thought he was gonna pull more, but I was gonna say that if you see that he's running quite a lot ahead, you really should use a movement ability. For me, that would have been Burning Rush, to catch up and to start dealing damage to the mobs that he's pulling as fast as possible, because again, that just speeds up the whole dungeon. Here there's a lot of mobs, but I don't have enough soul shards for my Rain of Fire, so I'm gonna try and build up to that as fast as possible. But while I was doing that, the mobs were already defeated, so there was no reason for me to cast it there. But here, since I already have it, I'm just gonna start off by casting it and then continue by spreading Immolate to as much enemies as possible. We've reached the last boss. You can tell which boss you're on by sort of this information on the right hand side. You can see that we've defeated 3 of them and that there's only 1 more left. You can see that I have a kind of a skull on me. That usually means that you've been targeted by something, or that something is going to happen to you, basically. There I didn't really deal with the ability that well, because there was a giant circle around me where an explosion was going to happen, and this mage was caught in that explosion. Once again, I'm targeted by the ability. This time I used the mobility ability, and now I'm safe. There's no enemies around me, so I can safely get hit by the rocket. But that's basically it. Again, to recap really quickly, follow your tank, follow your group, try not to take damage. If you are taking damage, try and mitigate it. If you've already taken damage, heal it up. Use AoE abilities when there's more than 3 mobs. Use single target abilities otherwise. And try and think about the next pack. Don't just focus on what's going on now. Try and focus on what's going to happen. That's about it. Thank you for joining, thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.